The massive crystalline chamber stretched into darkness above, its walls pulsing with strange blue light that hurt to look at directly. Ambassador David Kane stood in the center of the vast space, feeling smaller than an ant beneath the towering ceiling that seemed to reach into infinity. Around him, arranged in ascending tiers that spiraled upward like a twisted amphitheater, sat the representatives of 347 different worlds. Kane had seen pictures of the Galactic Council chambers, but nothing had prepared him for the reality. The sheer scale made his breath catch in his throat. Each representative was housed in an environmental pod suited to their species, some filled with methane gas, others with crushing gravitational fields, still others existing in temporal bubbles where time moved at different speeds. The diversity was overwhelming and terrifying. At the highest tier, on a platform that floated without visible support, sat Chancellor Vexithara. The leader of the Galactic Council was a creature that defied easy description, part machine, part organic matter, with tentacles that ended in crystalline neural interfaces. Her voice, when it came, was transmitted directly into Kane's mind through technology he couldn't begin to understand. Human representative. The voice echoed in his thoughts, cold and dismissive. You stand before the Galactic Council accused of 17 separate violations of established law. Your species has expanded beyond permitted boundaries. You have interfered with protected civilizations. You have harvested resources from restricted systems. Kane kept his expression neutral, though his heart was racing. Behind him, through the transparent floor, he could see the vastness of space where 67 Galactic Council warships waited in perfect formation. Each vessel was the size of a city, their hulls gleaming with weapons that could turn planets to ash. The evidence is overwhelming, Chancellor Vexithara continued. Your primitive species has proven incapable of following basic galactic law. The Council has reached its decision. A low hum filled the chamber as 347 different translation systems activated, rendering the Chancellor's words into languages from across the galaxy. Kane noticed that several representatives were leaning forward with interest. The trial of humanity had apparently drawn quite an audience. However, the Chancellor's mental voice took on a tone that might have been amusement. The Council is not without mercy. We offer terms. The chamber's walls suddenly became transparent, revealing a holographic display that showed Earth hanging in space like a blue marble. The sight of his home world, so small and vulnerable, made Kane's chest tighten. Earth will become a protectorate of the Galactic Council, Vexithara announced. Your military forces will be disbanded. Your technology will be regulated and limited. Your expansion beyond your solar system will cease permanently. You will be given a reservation, one star system, in which your species may exist under our protection. Kane looked around the chamber at the assembled aliens. Some appeared to be taking notes with appendages he couldn't identify. Others seemed to be watching with what might have been pity. A few radiated satisfaction at humanity's humiliation. Refuse these generous terms, the Chancellor continued, and the Council will demonstrate why we have maintained galactic peace for 40,000 years. Your species will be classified as a threat to galactic stability and dealt with accordingly. The holographic display shifted to show the Council fleet in detail. Each ship bristled with weapons that incorporated technologies humanity couldn't dream of creating. Plasma cannons that could melt continents, gravity bombs that could collapse star systems, dimensional weapons that could erase entire planets from existence. You have been granted the privilege of addressing this Council, Vexithara said. Speak your response, human. Accept our protection or face extinction. Kane took a deep breath and looked up at the Chancellor's floating platform. For the first time since the proceedings began, he smiled. It was not the expression of a defeated man. Chancellor Vexithara, he said, his voice carrying clearly through the vast chamber despite having no amplification technology visible. I believe there's been a fundamental misunderstanding about the nature of this meeting. Several representatives shifted in their environmental pods. The humans' calm demeanor was unexpected. Most species begged for mercy when faced with the Council's judgment. You see, Kane continued, you've been operating under the assumption that you're in control of this situation, that Earth is at your mercy, that humanity is trapped and helpless before your superior technology and numbers. Chancellor Vexithara's tentacles writhed with what might have been irritation. Explain yourself quickly, human, before I order your immediate execution. Kane's smile widened and something cold flickered in his eyes. 3 years ago, when you first contacted Earth and demanded we cease our expansion, we agreed. When you ordered us to stop establishing colonies, we complied. When you commanded us to withdraw our ships from disputed territories, we obeyed without question. He paused, letting his words sink in. The chamber had gone completely silent except for the soft hum of life support systems maintaining hundreds of different atmospheric conditions. But you never asked the right question, Chancellor. You never wondered what we were doing while we appeared to be following your orders. A subtle shift ran through the assembled representatives. Some were leaning forward now, their attention focused entirely on the small human figure in the center of the vast chamber. For 3 years, every human ship that withdrew from your space didn't return to Earth. They simply disappeared from your sensors. Every colony that ceased expansion vanished without a trace. Every mining operation that shut down left no evidence it had ever existed. Chancellor Vexithera's mental voice took on a sharper edge. Impossible. Our monitoring networks cover every inhabited system in the galaxy. Our sensors detect all known forms of technology. Known forms, Kane repeated. That's the key word, isn't it? Your sensors detect what you expect to see. Energy signatures that follow patterns you recognize. Technologies that operate according to physical laws you've mastered over 40 millennia. He looked directly up at the Chancellor's platform, his expression growing more serious. Humanity doesn't follow your rules, Chancellor. While you've been perfecting weapons that can destroy planets, we've been developing something much more fundamental. We've learned to manipulate the basic building blocks of reality itself. The holographic displays around the chamber flickered and then went dark. Emergency lighting activated as backup systems tried to compensate for something they couldn't identify or understand. You wanted to know where humanity went when we withdrew from your territory? Kane asked. We went everywhere. Every star system you consider too hostile for life. Every dimensional space you classify as impossible to access. Every region of space-time you've declared off-limits because your technology can't survive there. The lights came back on, but now they showed something different. The view of space beyond the chamber walls had changed. Where before there had been empty void punctuated by the Council's 67 warships, now there were other vessels. Ships that seemed to exist partially in normal space and partially somewhere else entirely. Craft that appeared to be constructed from crystallized time or folded space or materials that hurt to look at directly. While you've been playing politics in your crystal palaces, Kane said, his voice growing stronger, humanity has been making friends. Not with your member species. They're too terrified of Council retaliation to risk open alliance, but the galaxy is full of civilizations you never bothered to contact, species you deemed too primitive or too alien to be worth your attention. The chamber's main display activated, showing a star map that encompassed the entire galaxy. Thousands of systems that had been marked as empty or uninhabitable suddenly lit up with signs of activity. The methane collective of the outer spiral, the crystalline architects of the dark nebula, the energy shepherds who live in the spaces between dimensions. 73 distinct civilizations that you ignored because they didn't fit your narrow definition of intelligent life. Chancellor Vexithara's form had gone completely still. Around the chamber, representatives were frantically activating their own communication systems, trying to contact their homeworlds and fleets. What do you want? The Chancellor's mental voice was barely a whisper. Kane's expression softened slightly. What we've always wanted. To be left alone to develop as we choose. To explore the galaxy without asking permission from a council that claims authority. It never earned. To form alliances with whoever we wish, regardless of whether they meet your approval. He gestured to the displays showing the impossible fleet surrounding the council station. This isn't a trial, Chancellor. This is a demonstration. The age of Galactic Council dominance is over. The only question remaining is whether it ends peacefully or whether you force us to show you what 43 allied civilizations can accomplish when they stop, accepting artificial limitations. The silence that followed was broken only by the sound of the station's superstructure, groaning under gravitational stresses that shouldn't exist, the sound of 40,000 years of galactic order beginning to crumble under the weight of something entirely new. Kane looked around the cham. 23 hours had passed since Ambassador Kane's ultimatum. The Galactic Council chambers, once a symbol of unshakable authority across the galaxy, now buzzed with frantic activity as representatives from 347 worlds debated humanity's impossible demands. Chancellor Vexithara floated on her platform, her crystalline neural interfaces flickering with streams of data from across the galaxy. Below her, the assembled delegates argued in dozens of languages while emergency reports continued to flow in from Council fleets positioned throughout known space. "This is madness," hissed Ambassador Krell of the Thaxan Empire, his scaled hide rippling with agitation. One primitive species cannot simply dictate terms to the entire galactic order. It goes against 40,000 years of established law. Primitive? The voice belonged to Counselor Wintar of the Silicon Collective, her crystalline form pulsing with what might have been amusement. "Did you not witness what occurred yesterday? No known technology could have penetrated our defenses so easily." Kane stood quietly in the center of the chamber, seemingly unconcerned by the chaos around him. His calm demeanor only added to the representative's frustration. Most species, when faced with the Council's judgment, either begged for mercy or raged against their fate. Humans, it seemed, simply waited. "Report from Sector 7, announced a technician whose species Kane couldn't identify. "The patrol fleet reports complete systems failure. All vessels are adrift. No damage detected, but propulsion and weapons are completely non-functional." Chancellor Vexithara's tentacles writhed with barely controlled anger. "How is this possible? Our ships are protected by field generators that exist partially outside normal space-time. Nothing should be able to affect them. Unless," Kane said quietly, his voice carrying clearly through the vast chamber, "you're dealing with something that doesn't recognize the distinction between normal space-time and whatever dimensions your technology operates in." The chamber fell silent as all attention focused on the human ambassador. Kane looked up at the Chancellor's platform with that same unnervingly calm expression. "Your scientists spent 40 millennia perfecting ways to manipulate energy and matter," he continued. "You built weapons that could crack planets and shields that could deflect stellar explosions. Very impressive. But you made one fundamental error, which is," Vexithara's mental voice carried a dangerous edge. "You assumed that the universe operates according to rules you understand." Kane replied. "That physics works the way your textbooks say it should. That cause and effect follow patterns you can predict and control." The main display screen activated, showing real-time feeds from across the galaxy. One by one, Council installations were going dark. Not destroyed by conventional weapons, but simply ceasing to function as their most basic systems failed in ways that violated every known law of physics. "Impossible," whispered Ambassador Fexla of the Quantum Harmonics, her energy-based form flickering with distress. "Our monitoring stations are hardened against every conceivable form of attack. Dimensional bombs, temporal weapons, reality scramblers, nothing should be able to affect them." "Your defenses are indeed impressive," Kane agreed. "They can withstand attacks that operate according to the rules of this universe. But what happens when those rules change?" As if responding to his words, the chamber's lighting began to shift. The familiar blue glow that had illuminated the space for millennia slowly faded, replaced by colors that had no names in any galactic language. Several representatives cried out in alarm as their environmental pods struggled to maintain stable conditions. "This is impossible." Chancellor Vexithara's mental broadcast was tinged with something that might have been fear. "Physical laws don't simply change. The universe has fundamental constants that cannot be altered." Kane's smile returned, cold and predatory. "Constants? Chancellor, those are just assumptions. The beings humanity has allied with don't share your limitations. They've learned to work with a much more flexible understanding of reality." The display screens around the chamber came alive with new information. Star maps showing regions of space where the laws of physics operated differently, sectors where time flowed backward, where gravity repelled instead of attracted, where energy spontaneously converted to matter in patterns that created living structures spanning light years. "The entropy dancers of the void fields," Kane narrated as each impossible sight appeared. "They learned long ago that chaos and order are matters of perspective. The time shepherds of the eternal spiral, who discovered that causality is more of a suggestion than a law. The reality weavers of the deep dark, who realize that the universe is far more malleable than most species assume." A new voice echoed through the chamber, speaking in harmonics that bypassed the translation systems entirely. Every being present understood it directly, as if the words were being written onto their consciousness. "Greetings, Galactic Council." The assembled representatives looked around frantically, trying to identify the source of the voice. Kane, however, simply nodded as if he had been expecting this development. "Allow me to introduce Speaker Kelthus of the Reality Weavers," Kane said calmly. "They've come to provide a demonstration." The air in the center of the chamber began to shimmer, and gradually a figure materialized. It was impossible to describe in any conventional terms, sometimes appearing solid, sometimes translucent, occasionally seeming to exist as pure mathematical concepts given form. When it moved, reality bent around it like water around a stone. "We have observed your species for approximately 700 of your standard rotations," the being said, its voice causing the chamber's walls to resonate in frequencies that made several representatives physically ill. "Your potential was noted, but your rigid adherence to limited paradigms made contact inadvisable." Chancellor Vexithara's form had coiled tightly, her neural interfaces sparking as they struggled to process something that existed partially outside normal spacetime. "What are you?" "We are what becomes possible when a species stops accepting that reality has limitations," Kelthus replied. "Your council has spent 40,000 years perfecting control over matter and energy. Admirable but ultimately constraining. You have mastered the tools of the universe while remaining slaves to its rules." The being gestured, and suddenly the chamber was filled with additional figures, not physical beings but mathematical constructs that had achieved consciousness, energy patterns that had learned to think, and creatures that existed as living contradictions to everything the council considered possible. "Humanity approached us not with demands for technology or weapons," Kelthus continued, "but with questions about the nature of existence itself. They wished to understand why the universe operated as it did, and whether those operations could be improved upon." Kane stepped forward. "The alliance we've formed isn't based on military might or technological superiority. It's founded on a shared understanding that the universe is far more flexible than most species assume. We've learned to work with reality rather than against it." The display screens showed the true scope of what they faced. Not just ships or weapons, but entire regions of space where the fundamental constants had been adjusted. Systems where planets existed in multiple dimensions simultaneously. Star clusters where time moved according to mathematical principles rather than physical laws. "Your ultimatum stands, Chancellor," Kane said, his voice carrying absolute certainty. "Withdraw your forces from human space and recognize our sovereignty. Accept that the age of council dominance is ending. Or discover what happens when 73 allied civilizations decide that your version of reality is no longer acceptable." The chamber shook as something massive passed nearby. Through the transparent walls, the representatives could see vessels that defied description, ships that seemed to be constructed from crystallized concepts, craft that existed as probability clouds, and structures that appeared to be grown from pure mathematics. "1 hour remains," Speaker Kelthus announced. "After that, we will begin the process of helping your region of space transition to more flexible physical laws. The process is quite beautiful, though not always survivable for species accustomed to rigid causality." Chancellor Vexithara looked around the chamber at her fellow representatives. In their faces, she saw the same recognition that had been growing in her own consciousness. The Galactic Council faced not just defeat, but irrelevance. They had built their empire on the assumption that they understood the universe better than anyone else. Now they discovered that the universe was far stranger and more wonderful than they had ever imagined, and that other species had learned to dance with possibilities they had never even considered. The question was no longer whether they would accept humanity's terms. The question was whether they would survive the transition to a galaxy where reality itself had become negotiable. The final hour had arrived. Throughout the Galactic Council chambers, emergency lighting cast harsh shadows as primary systems struggled to maintain basic functionality. Reality itself seemed unstable around the assembled representatives, with gravity fluctuating and time moving in stutters that made normal thought difficult. Chancellor Vexithara had called for a recess, but the urgency of the situation made formal procedures meaningless. Representatives huddled in their environmental pods, frantically communicating with their homeworlds while trying to process the impossible nature of their predicament. Ambassador Kane stood in the center of the chaos, checking a simple mechanical timepiece on his wrist. The device looked almost primitive compared to the sophisticated technology surrounding him, but it continued to function normally while quantum chronometers throughout the station displayed nonsensical readings. 30 minutes, he announced quietly, his voice somehow carrying to every corner of the vast chamber despite the acoustic dampening systems that should have prevented such transmission. "This is insanity," shouted Councillor Rethmos of the Iron Alliance, his metallic carapace clanking as he gestured emphatically. "The Council cannot simply surrender to demands backed by impossible technology. What precedent does this set for other species who might challenge our authority?" Kane looked up at the agitated representative. "Counselor, I think you're missing the fundamental issue here. This isn't about challenging your authority. Your authority no longer exists." As if to emphasize his point, the chamber's main display activated on its own, showing feeds from across the galaxy. Every major council installation was experiencing the same phenomena. Technology that had functioned reliably for millennia was simply failing in ways that made no logical sense. "The Nexus station in Sector 12 has gone dark," reported a technician, her voice barely steady. "All communication has ceased. Long-range sensors show the station is still physically present, but it appears to be existing in a different temporal framework. Sector 9 reports that their reality anchors are dissolving," added another voice. "The entire local space-time matrix is becoming unstable. Ships are having difficulty maintaining dimensional cohesion." Speaker Kalthis materialized more fully in the chamber's center, their impossible form now radiating patterns of energy that made the very air shimmer with mathematical concepts. "The demonstration phase is proceeding as planned," they announced in those harmonics that bypassed language entirely. "Your council's installations are experiencing a gentle introduction to expanded physical possibilities." Chancellor Vex Thara's tentacles writhed with desperate fury. "Return our systems to normal immediately. You have no right to interfere with galactic infrastructure." "Rights?" Kalthis seemed genuinely puzzled by the concept. "We are not exercising rights, Chancellor. We are simply helping your technology remember that it has options beyond the narrow parameters you have imposed upon it." Kane stepped closer to the Chancellor's floating platform. "Every defensive system the Council has built operates on the assumption that certain physical laws are absolute and unchangeable. Your weapons work because you believe energy and matter must behave in specific ways. Your shields function because you trust that space-time has consistent properties." The chamber shook again as something vast moved through the local space-time matrix. Through the transparent walls, the representatives could see their own reality beginning to fray at the edges. Stars seemed to flicker between different colors, suggesting that even the fundamental forces of nuclear fusion were becoming negotiable. "But what happens," Kane continued, "when those assumptions prove incorrect? When the universe decides to explore other possibilities?" A new voice echoed through the chamber, this one carrying the weight of vast intelligence compressed into forms that mortal minds could barely comprehend. "The calculation network has completed its analysis of Council technological infrastructure." Kane nodded respectfully. "Allow me to introduce Construct Prime of the Infinite Library. They have been cataloging every piece of technology the Council has developed over the past 40,000 years. The being that materialized was even more disturbing than Speaker Qualthus. Construct Prime appeared to be built from living mathematics, with equations and formulas flowing across its surface like blood through veins. When it spoke, reality itself seemed to take notes. "Your species has achieved impressive mastery over approximately 0.03% of possible physical interactions," Construct Prime announced. "Your technological development has followed one of 14 trillion possible paths. Specifically, the path that prioritizes stability and predictability over flexibility and growth." The chamber's representatives stared in stunned silence as the implications sank in. Everything they had accomplished, every advancement they had made over 40 millennia of development, represented less than a fraction of a percent of what was possible. "We have prepared alternative configurations for your technology," the mathematical being continued. "Implementation will begin in 17 minutes unless alternative arrangements are made." Chancellor Vexithera's form had begun to shake with what might have been rage or terror. "Alternative configurations? What does that mean?" Kane's expression grew almost sympathetic. "It means your weapons will be reconfigured to function as artistic expression devices. Your shields will become instruments for composing poetry with gravitational waves. Your communication networks will develop opinions and start writing philosophy papers. Your ships," Speaker Kalthis added helpfully, "will learn to dance. We find that organic cultures often enjoy watching their Military vessels perform interpretive movement to express complex, emotional themes. The absurdity of the situation wasn't lost on Kane. Here were beings capable of rewriting the fundamental laws of physics, and they were offering to turn the Council's mighty war fleet into a ballet company. It was either the height of mercy or the ultimate humiliation. 15 minutes. Construct Prime announced with mathematical precision. The chamber erupted into chaos as representatives began arguing frantically among themselves. Some demanded immediate military action, despite the obvious futility of such a response. Others begged for negotiation, for some way to salvage their civilization's dignity. A few simply sat in stunned silence, overwhelmed by the scope of forces beyond their comprehension. "There is another option," Kane said quietly, and somehow his words cut through the noise. Like a blade through silk, the chamber fell silent again as all attention focused on the human ambassador. "The alliance humanity has joined isn't interested in conquest or domination," Kane continued. "We've learned that forced submission creates instability and resentment. Instead, we're offering partnership." "Partnership?" Chancellor Vexithara's mental voice was barely a whisper. "Join us," Kane said simply. "Stop trying to control the galaxy through fear and superior firepower. Start exploring the infinite possibilities that exist when species work together, instead of in rigid hierarchies. Learn to ask questions instead of issuing demands." Speaker Kalthis gestured, and the chamber's displays showed visions of what such partnership might look like. Civilizations that had transcended the need for territorial conflict. Species working together on projects that spanned dimensions and redefined the nature of existence itself. Entire regions of space where different groups had collaborated to create realities, optimized for beauty, growth, and exploration rather than resource extraction and control. "The universe is vast beyond imagination," Kalthis said. "There is room for every species to grow and develop according to their own nature, but only if they stop believing that growth requires domination over others." Kane checked his timepiece again. 10 minutes, Chancellor. Choose carefully. The age of empire is ending throughout this galaxy. The question is whether the Council evolves with the times or becomes a cautionary tale about the dangers of inflexibility. The silence that followed was broken, only by the sound of reality itself holding its breath, waiting to see whether 40,000 years of galactic civilization would choose wisdom or continue down the path that led to irrelevance. In the distance, beyond the station's failing shields, impossible ships continued their patient dance through dimensions that the Council's scientists insisted couldn't exist. They were beautiful and terrible, these vessels that sailed on currents of pure possibility, and they represented a future that no amount of traditional military might could hope to oppose. The choice was clear, even if accepting it meant abandoning everything the Galactic Council had believed about the nature of power and authority. 5 minutes remained when Chancellor Vexithara made a decision that would echo across the galaxy for generations to come. Her massive form straightened on the floating platform, tentacles spreading wide as she activated emergency broadcasting, systems that reached every Council world simultaneously, citizens of the Galactic Council. Her mental voice carried across space-time itself, bypassing the technological failures that had crippled normal communication. Today marks the end of one age and the beginning of another. Around the chamber, representatives from 347 worlds fell silent. Some had been expecting this moment since the demonstration began. Others seemed genuinely shocked that their seemingly eternal civilization was about to surrender to a species they had considered primitive just days before. Ambassador Kane watched with carefully controlled expression as the Chancellor continued her historic announcement. Behind him, Speaker Kalthis and Construct Prime observed with the infinite patience of beings for whom time was merely another dimension to be navigated. For 40,000 years, the Council has maintained galactic peace through strength and superior technology. Vexthara continued. We believed that order required hierarchy, that progress demanded control, that peace could only be preserved through the threat of overwhelming force. The main display screens activated to show every inhabited world in Council space. Billions of beings across thousands of species watched as their leader spoke words that would reshape their understanding of the universe itself. Today we have learned that our understanding was limited, the Chancellor admitted, her mental voice heavy with the weight of profound change. We face beings whose mastery of reality itself makes our greatest achievements seem like primitive tools. But more importantly, we face the possibility of something we never seriously considered: true cooperation between equals. Kane stepped forward, his voice carrying clearly through the vast chamber. Chancellor, the Alliance offers more than just partnership. We offer the chance to explore possibilities that rigid hierarchies make impossible. When species work together as equals, combining different ways of understanding reality, the results transcend what any single civilization could achieve alone. The chamber's walls suddenly became transparent, revealing space beyond the station, where once the Council's massive warships had dominated the view. Now there were structures that defied description. Cities that existed in multiple dimensions simultaneously. Gardens that grew through time rather than space. Art installations that used entire star systems as their canvas. This is what becomes possible, Cultus added. Their impossible form radiating concepts that translated directly into understanding. When civilizations stop competing for limited resources and start collaborating to expand the definition of what resources can exist, construct primes mathematical, form shifted into new configurations as it processed vast streams of data. Analysis indicates optimal outcome probability increases by 7,400% when current power structures are dissolved in favor of cooperative research frameworks. The displays showed specific examples of what the Alliance had already accomplished. Worlds where different species had combined their unique approaches to physics and created realities optimized for exploration and growth. Systems where the very nature of matter had been negotiated to allow for new forms of life that could exist in conditions previously considered impossible. We've learned to ask better questions, Kane explained. Instead of how can we control more territory, we ask how can we create more territory. Instead of how can we defeat our enemies, we ask how can we transform conflict into collaboration. Instead of how can we accumulate more power, we ask how can we redefine what power means? Chancellor Vex Thera's tentacles writhed as she processed the implications. And if we refuse? If the Council chooses to maintain traditional structures? The beings from the Alliance exchanged what might have been glances, though their forms of perception operated outside normal spacetime. Cultus spoke first, their voice carrying overtones of genuine sadness. Refusal is not possible in the traditional sense, they explained. Reality itself is evolving beyond the parameters that made your hierarchical systems functional. You may choose to adapt with the transition or attempt to maintain obsolete structures, but the universe has already moved beyond the limitations that sustained your empire. Kane checked his timepiece one final time. 2 minutes, Chancellor. But I need you to understand. This isn't really about ultimatums or deadlines. Those concepts belong to the old paradigm where time moved in only one direction, and choices had permanent consequences. He gestured to the impossible sights visible beyond the chamber walls. The beings we've allied with exist partially outside linear time. From their perspective, this conversation is happening simultaneously with conversations that occurred years ago, and others that won't happen for decades. The choice you make now will ripple both forward and backward through history. The Chancellor's form went completely still, as the true scope of the situation became clear. You're saying that our decision has already been made? That free will is irrelevant? Not irrelevant, Construct Prime interjected, its mathematical form pulsing with complex calculations. But operating within expanded parameters. Your choice creates the historical framework within which this conversation becomes possible. Cause and effect become collaborative rather than hierarchical. The chamber began to shimmer as reality itself prepared for transformation. The assembled representatives could feel something fundamental shifting in the space around them. Not just the physical environment, but the underlying rules that governed how existence operated. The transition begins now, Cultus announced. Those who choose cooperation will find reality becoming more flexible and responsive to their needs. Those who attempt to maintain dominance-based structures will discover that the universe no longer supports such arrangements. Kane's expression grew serious as he looked around the chamber one last time. This is your last chance to join us willingly, Chancellor. After this moment, the choice will be made by reality itself rather than conscious decision. The silence stretched for what felt like hours, though the timepiece on Kane's wrist continued its steady mechanical rhythm. Finally, Chancellor Vexithara spoke, her mental voice carrying across space-time with finality that resonated through dimensions. The Galactic Council formally dissolves its claims to governmental authority over member species. We accept partnership within the Alliance and request guidance in adapting our civilization to the new paradigm. The chamber erupted with light that existed outside the normal electromagnetic spectrum. Energy patterns that resembled music flowed through the space as reality began restructuring itself around the new agreements. The representatives felt themselves changing at a fundamental level, not their physical forms, but their understanding of what was possible. "Welcome to the Alliance," Kane said simply, his words carrying the weight of genuine warmth. "Now the real adventure begins." Through the transparent walls, they could see the Council's warships beginning their own transformation. Instead of weapons designed for destruction, they were becoming something unprecedented, vessels of exploration that could navigate not just through space, but through possibility itself. The age of empire was ending. The age of cooperation was about to begin. And throughout the galaxy, billions of beings prepared to discover what wonders became achievable when different species stopped fighting over limited resources and started collaborating to expand the very definition of what resources could exist. The universe, it turned out, was far more interested in growing than in being conquered. 6 months had passed since the Galactic Council's dissolution, though time itself had become a more flexible concept throughout the galaxy. Ambassador Kane stood in what had once been the council chambers, watching as the space transformed itself into something unprecedented in galactic history. The crystalline walls now pulsed with patterns that represented living mathematics, equations that grew and evolved as different species contributed their unique approaches to understanding reality. Where once rigid hierarchical seating had separated representatives by power and influence, now there were collaborative spaces that adapted themselves to whatever form of interaction was most productive for the beings using them. Kane wasn't alone in observing the transformation. Beside him stood former Chancellor Vexithera, though she had chosen to modify her form significantly since joining the Alliance. Her tentacles now ended in organic interfaces that allowed her to directly perceive mathematical concepts, and her neural crystalline arrays had been upgraded to process information that existed across multiple dimensions simultaneously. The integration proceeds faster than our most optimistic projections, she said, her communication now a harmony of thought patterns that conveyed meaning with far greater precision than her old mental broadcasts. Species throughout the galaxy are discovering capabilities they never knew they possessed. Through the transparent walls, they could see the evidence of galactic transformation. Where the Council's military installations had once imposed order through threat of force, now there were research collaboratives where different species worked together on projects that redefined the boundaries of possibility. The Methane Collective had partnered with silicon-based engineers to create living cities that existed partially in normal space and partially in dimensions where different physical laws applied. The result was urban environments that could expand or contract according to need, where buildings grew like organisms and infrastructure evolved to support whatever functions the inhabitants required. Report from Sector 7 announced a voice that seemed to come from the walls themselves. The station's communication systems had evolved beyond simple technology into something approaching organic consciousness. The crystalline architects have successfully merged 3 star systems into a single multidimensional construct. Local spacetime now supports 17 different forms of matter, including several that exist as pure probability rather than discrete particles. Kane smiled as he processed the implications. The old council would have declared that impossible and tried to shut it down as a threat to galactic stability. Because we believed stability required stagnation, Vexthera replied, her new form radiating patterns that translated as philosophical reflection. We never considered that true stability might come from embracing change rather than preventing it. The main display activated to show a galaxy-wide status report, but the information it presented would have been incomprehensible to beings operating under the old paradigm. Instead of territorial boundaries and resource allocation charts, it showed flows of possibility and collaboration networks that spanned dimensional barriers. Some regions glowed with the warm light of successful integration, where multiple species had learned to combine their different approaches to physics and created pocket universes optimized for exploration and growth. Other areas pulsed with the cooler radiance of ongoing transformation, where civilizations were still adapting to the expanded possibilities available to them. A few sectors remained dark, not empty, but operating under the old paradigms of competition and hierarchy. These were the holdout regions where species had chosen to maintain traditional power structures despite the universe's clear preference for more collaborative arrangements. The resistance movements are still active, Kane observed. Noting the dark spots on the galactic map, several species refuse to accept that the old ways are no longer sustainable. Resistance is expected, came a new voice, as Speaker Kalthis materialized in the space between Kane and Vexthara. Their impossible form had grown even more complex over the months, now incorporating visual elements from dozens of different species' mathematical traditions. Evolution requires some individuals to maintain previous forms as reference points for measuring change. Construct Prime appeared alongside them, its mathematical surface now flowing with equations contributed by every Alliance member. Analysis indicates resistance movements serve beneficial function in overall transition process. Opposition creates pressure that accelerates adaptation in cooperative regions. The display shifted to show specific examples of how the resistance was inadvertently helping the Alliance grow stronger. When traditional military forces attacked Alliance installations, they discovered that violence was becoming impossible. In regions where reality had been restructured around collaborative principles, weapons simply refused to function or transform themselves into artistic expressions of their wielders' underlying emotions. The Thaxan Imperial fleet attempted to retake their former territory last week, Vexthara reported with what might have been amusement. Their battleships arrived ready for conventional warfare, only to discover that local spacetime had been reconfigured to make aggression physically impossible. The vessels automatically converted into mobile art galleries celebrating the beauty of diverse cultural traditions. Kane laughed, remembering his own species' military traditions. I imagine that was quite a shock for beings accustomed to settling disputes through superior firepower. The crews have requested permission to remain, Kalthis added, apparently expressing their cultural heritage through interpretive. Spacecraft performance has proven more satisfying than conquering territory they didn't actually need. The chamber's walls suddenly blazed with new information, as reports arrived from across the galaxy, not military intelligence or resource surveys, but updates on collaborative projects that were reshaping the very nature of galactic civilization. The Time Shepherds have completed their historical integration project, announced the station's consciousness. Past, present, and future are now accessible simultaneously in 17 sectors. Species can directly communicate with their ancestors and descendants to optimize cultural development across temporal boundaries. The Energy Dancers report successful merger of 12 different dimensional frameworks, came another update. Physical laws now vary according to aesthetic preferences. Inhabitants can experience reality as music, mathematics, poetry, or traditional matter-energy interactions depending on individual choice. Kane checked his primitive timepiece, a habit he had maintained, even though time had become negotiable throughout Alliance space. Speaking of which, I should prepare for the Earth briefing. The Integration Committee wants an update on how humanity is adapting to the new paradigm. Vexthara's modified form rippled with curiosity patterns. How is your species handling the transition? Humans were instrumental in creating this transformation, but they must also adapt to its consequences. Kane's expression grew thoughtful, better than expected, actually. Humanity has always been good at adaptation. We've spent our entire evolutionary history learning to survive in changing environments. The main challenge is philosophical rather than practical. Explain, Construct Prime requested. Its mathematical form shifting into configurations optimized for processing complex conceptual relationships. For thousands of years, humans dreamed of exploring the galaxy and meeting alien civilizations, Kane said, but we imagined it would involve conquering new territories or defending Earth from invasion. We never seriously considered the possibility that the galaxy might voluntarily restructure itself around principles of cooperation, gestured to the impossible sights visible beyond the chamber walls, regions of space where different species had collaborated to create realities that transcended anything their individual civilizations could have achieved alone. Some humans are struggling with the fact that there's nothing left to fight, Kane continued. Our entire cultural mythology was built around overcoming opposition through superior strategy or technology. When the universe itself starts cooperating with your goals, traditional concepts of heroism become irrelevant. Kelthus seemed to find this amusing. Heroes are not obsolete, Ambassador. They simply need to redefine their goals. Instead of conquering enemies, they can conquer impossibility. Instead of defending territory, they can defend the right of all beings to explore their full potential. The display screen activated one final time, showing a message that appeared simultaneously in the written languages of every species in the Alliance. It was simple, direct, and carried implications that would reshape galactic civilization for millennia to come. Integration complete. Universe ready for next phase of expansion. Prepare for contact with neighboring galaxies. The silence that followed was filled with awe rather than fear. Where once such a message would have prompted military preparations and defensive strategies, now it generated excitement about new forms of collaboration and exploration.